Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we will be taking a look at the challenges the restaurant industry is facing during this lockdown. We will be talking to the president of the National Restaurant Association of India, Mr. Anurag Katriyar, about it. We will also take a look at how a district in Maharashtra, through color-coded passes, is trying to stop the coronavirus from infecting its people. But first, we talk about the World Health Organization, or WHO. On Wednesday, US President Donald Trump announced that he was cutting funding to the WHO. He made this announcement and accused the organization by saying that it failed to do enough to stop the virus from spreading when it first surfaced in China.
Today, I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization while a review is conducted to assess the World Health Organization's role in severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus. Everybody knows what's going on there. American taxpayers provide between $400 million and $500 million per year to the WHO. In contrast, China contributes roughly $40 million a year, and even less. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability. One of the most dangerous and costly decisions from the WHO was its disastrous decision to oppose travel restrictions from China and other nations.
This announcement comes at a time when the number of COVID-19 cases in the world are approaching 20 lakh, and over 1 lakh people have died due to the virus. The US right now has the highest number of cases, over 6 lakhs, and the most number of deaths, over 26,000. In the first segment, Avantika Ghosh, who reports on health and who has been extensively reporting on the coronavirus outbreak, now joins us to talk about the reasons for Trump's decision and to what extent it will impact the WHO. Avantika, could you first talk about the role that the World Health Organization plays?
So the World Health Organization, it works across 194 member states across 6 regions, and it basically plays an advisory role in leading the global response to diseases and to not just emerging diseases, but also existing health challenges, communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, everything. So they have this body of experts and they show the way. So there is this sense that health is not something that countries alone can achieve. If India has achieved polio-free status and across the border there is another country where polio is still happening, then even for India, it is important that that other country also becomes polio-free, because we will always have the risk of getting polio from that country across the border. So it's that sort of thought that drove the formation of WHO essentially. But they do not have the authority to enforce anything on any country. So, for example, if they say masks, they are not required, it is the countries who decide whether masks are required or not, depending on their assessment of the situation. So if you look at it as a partnership with the respective country being the senior partner, not WHO. WHO will give you support in the field and wherever else you require, but it's not bigger than the country where it's working in.
What has been WHO's biggest contribution in a country like India?
WHO is involved in a whole lot of programs in India, immunization very closely involved. They've worked in polio. Right now, they are working in a big way on universal health coverage. So they've given inputs for PMJ. So it also depends on states how and in what program they want support. So for example, all these neglected tropical diseases like TB, leprosy. So I guess what is India's biggest health success? Probably polio. And WHO has had a role to play. So instead of answering your question just the way you phrased it, WHO has contributions in a large number of programs and it plays a supportive role.
So obviously, WHO is a big organization. It has 150 offices across the world. It has all these roles that you just mentioned. How exactly is it funded?
It is funded by various ways. So the bulk of its funding comes from these 194 member states, more than 35%, 35.41% of its finances. Then there are all these philanthropic foundations like Gavi and Melinda Gates Foundation and all that. They contribute 9.33%. Then there are these non-government organizations that fund, development banks fund, then United Nations organizations fund. There are private sector entities that fund, local governments that sometimes fund. So there are many, many different ways that it's funded. But the biggest contribution, biggest chunk is from member states. And of them, the biggest member state in terms of money is the United States. In fact, it's the single biggest contributor to WHO, which accounts for 14.67% of all WHO funding, followed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which donates 9.76%, and the Gavi Alliance, which donates 8.39%. And in terms of country donations, the second biggest contributor actually is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which contributes 7.79%, and then Germany, which contributes 5.68%.
Okay, so now US President Donald Trump has decided to halt the funding that US gives to WHO. What have been the reasons for this decision?
Trump has been very upset with the way WHO has functioned, and also he has, in his view of WHO's functioning, he seems to suggest that WHO is basically shielding China. China could have done much more right at the beginning of the outbreak to prevent this huge scale of the pandemic, and WHO was slow in catching up to that. That is his assessment. What he basically said is that there will be a review that will be conducted to assess WHO's role in severely, within quotes, severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus. But having said that, there is also this thing that if you look at the WHO finances and if you look at where the money goes, you'll see the Americas is where USA is the biggest donor, as I mentioned, but Americas is also where the least amount of the money goes in terms of program expenditure. So in a sense, when he does this in an election year, I'm sure that's going to sort of connect to his core constituency also, because US is, like the rest of the world, is staring at a slowdown. There are going to be hardships. There are going to be hardships. Already welfare checks are going out in the name of the president. So all of that's taken together, this narrative, this decision to withdraw funding for WHO also fits in Trump's narrative of sort of America for the Americans, and we will not let others come in, or we will not let our resources be squandered elsewhere in the world, places which don't matter. That's the sort of narrative that he's built throughout his sort of tenure. And now that he's looking at re-election, that's again a constituency he would like to address. And last time this tone had given him rich dividends. He would want to replay that now, and I think that's where he's headed. Also, this helps his narrative in another way because US right now has the most number of cases, the most number of deaths, to pass on the blame somewhere else, and not just pass on the blame, because the moment you pass on the blame, the next question that comes is, why are you still funding them? So he will show that they are to be blamed, and this is just retribution for their failure. So it's something that very nicely fits into his scheme of things right now, I would say.
Have other countries also criticized WHO in this regard?
No, not this openly. In fact, many countries have actually criticized the US response. And India has not given any response at all. They've said that this is not the time to discuss these things. But Germany has. Many other countries have been critical. UN has been critical, saying that this is not the time for such a decision. See, many countries have chosen their own path. India has taken decisions on COVID irrespective of what at that point of time the WHO suggests countries should do. But I don't think anybody has been so vocally against the WHO and so critical of the WHO. I don't think any other country has been.
Now, the decision on whether US resumes funding will be made after a review which Trump says would last 60 to 90 days. How much will this decision to halt the funding impact WHO's efforts during this pandemic?
Right. Dr. Tedros, who's the Director General of WHO, he has already said that the organization is reviewing the impact of the withdrawal of the US funding, and it is in the process of working with partners to fill any financial gaps so that the work is uninterrupted. Also, I doubt if a withdrawal will have immediate impact, as in immediately whether it will affect the pandemic response and the working of the WHO and all that. I do not think that is going to be the case. But yes, obviously, because it's such a big funder, there are bound to be repercussions. And at this point of time, I'm sure all the philanthropic organizations that are donors would sort of step in and fill some of the gap at least. So I don't actually see this impacting the immediate COVID response.
Next, we talk about restaurants. In previous episodes, we have talked about the hit that various industries have taken due to the lockdown that has been put in place due to the coronavirus outbreak. Today, we will talk about the kind of impact it has had on the restaurant industry of India, an industry that largely depends on people going out and having food together. It is an industry that employs around 7.3 million people, and it's their jobs that are on the line right now. In this segment, we speak to Anurag Katriyar, the Executive Director and CEO of Digastibus Hospitality Private Limited, which runs restaurants like Indigo, Tote on the Surf, and Dakshin Rasoi. He's also the President of the National Restaurants Association of India. Mr. Katriyar, could you talk about the kind of challenges the restaurant industry is facing right now under the lockdown?
But right now, with the lockdown and all businesses being shut, there are two major issues that we are facing. One is how to ensure that the kitchen fires in the houses of our employees are kept burning. That's a very, very important human issue that we are facing. And with our limited cash reserve, that's a challenge. The other thing is, while the government has enabled us to do home deliveries, in absence of any public transport being available anywhere, that is a very massive challenge that we are facing. And while we are enabled to do it, we are not being able to do the food delivery in the right earnest.
Could you talk about some problems that are unique and specific to the restaurant industry? Problems that may not be obvious to an average restaurant goer?
First of all, I think the sheer size of the people that we employ in our sector is a very massive thing, almost 7.3 million people. And the second unique problem of our trade, if I talk, there are two. One is that the proportion of fixed operating expense in our trade is probably higher than any other trade. And lastly, you have to understand that what we deal in, our stocks are largely perishable. So the kind of losses that we have incurred because of this lockdown in terms of our stocks is massive. To give you an estimate, just the wastage of beer could be running into 100 crores. And we are not even talking about food now. So that is a big thing. Like in a garment, your garment can be reused later. It can be sold. In our case, we are only dealing with perishable inventory.
Are restaurants still paying their employees?
Yes, people have paid for March in pretty much in entirety. April onwards, there'll be problems, and these problems are largely out of lack of resources than intent. And I think in April, most of the industry will be paying partial salaries to their employees. I don't think anybody will be in a position to afford full month salary.
What percentage of running the business, the cost of running the business, is the money that goes to employees' salaries?
Anything ranging from 20 to 25%, I would say.
I'm guessing rental would be a huge cost at this point, right?
Right, absolutely.
Could you emphasize on just how big a cost rental is and just how much of a problem that is for businesses right now?
In high streets, certain high streets and malls of India, in Bombay and Delhi especially, the rates are like Manhattan, while the consumption or the spending prowess is not the same. I think very conservatively, you can say 20 to 25% of our revenue goes into rentals. Right now, I think this is the biggest crisis that has been faced by mankind in last century or so. And I think as we speak, I feel if this is not a fit case to invoke the clause of force majeure, then there is no point having it ever. So I think we are very, very sure that we are under force majeure right now and we don't need to pay. That solves our immediate problem. But going forward, once we open, we will need to move to a more, if I may call, a variable form of rental than fixed rental to make sure that the businesses survive.
And you earlier mentioned that deliveries are still going on. How much does that help? How much does an average restaurant depend on deliveries as their source of earnings?
So for a very typical restaurant, the proportion is not very high. Probably 10-12% of their business comes out of deliveries. There are, of course, delivery-only places or QSRs where the proportion could be very high. But under the current circumstances, while people are operating, the amount of money that they are making, a number of orders that they are getting is virtually a fraction of what it would be in a normal course. Reasons are multifold. I think there is a little bit of scare in the minds of the consumer about the safety, hygiene. Lots of societies, housing societies and offices are closed and not allowing delivery of food. So there are factors like that.
Earlier this month, the National Restaurant Association of India had reached out to the government for help. Could you talk about what were some of the demands that were put forth?
So, this was, I think, late last month. We had written to the Honorable Finance Minister, and we had made a representation initially, which I called that these are the life-saving support systems that we require. And the gist of the idea at that point of time was to do things which can free up my cash flow that can be plowed back into human issues, which is our employees, our small suppliers, and even those marginal farmers who supply to us. So that was the whole idea. So things like deferment of all statutory dues like GST or anything. There were things like moratorium on loans and so on and so forth. What we had also suggested was that, people problem is a very important problem to look at right now. So if the government could look at using the vast coffers of ESIC to pay the people who are covered under the Act, because this is a corpus which is made out of the contribution made by the employee and the employer, and it is meant to be used in places like this. On the long-term issues, we had also sought something like, allowing input tax credit on GST in our industry, because that is taking up our proportion of fixed operating expenses even higher. And more importantly, I think denial of input tax credit on GST goes against the basic grain of GST. So these were some of the demands that we had made initially.
Have you heard, or does it seem likely that the government will respond to these demands? Have you heard anything since then?
A couple of things have happened. I think, for example, deferment of taxes have happened. And RBI has announced a moratorium on loans. But beyond that, unfortunately, things have not moved at a very big pace. I understand that relief package 2.0 is on the cards, and we are hoping that some more of these issues will get covered in that.
India had been experiencing an economic slowdown. It had a demand problem even before the lockdown. How was the restaurant industry faring before all this?
So there was definitely a bit of a downturn in the business, but it was still at a manageable level in the pre-COVID days. We were having tough times. There were lots of businesses which were in the red, but it was not at a level where you started worrying about your existence. Post-COVID and post-lockdown, I think we are staring at an existential crisis.
What are some of the tough decisions that you are having to make at this point when it comes to running your own restaurants?
Oh, right now, I think the toughest part is how to feed our people, how to keep them going on our salary rolls. Very clearly, I don't think all our restaurants will be operational immediately after the lockdown is over. But at this stage, the toughest decision is to tell the people to go. Because if we let them go right now, they won't have a job in the times to come. So yes, that's the toughest call to take. I know certain businesses will not restart, but I don't have the heart right now to tell the employees of those places to go.
In what ways do you suspect the industry will change once this is over?
Tough one to say, because it is dependent on many unknown factors right now, such as how long will the lockdown last? How long will the scare of the virus in the air last post the lockdown is lifted? And what is the level of damage that it will leave us with? But I think one thing has been very, very clear, that the industry needs to move to a low risk and asset light model at the earliest. On the operating side, I think it's time now where hygiene of people and material, and when I say people, it includes the way guest is treated in a restaurant, needs to be revisited all over again. They will become mainstream. I personally believe that going forward in the post-COVID era, the theme of any marketing, the USP of any marketing will be around how safe and hygienic the place is than how good his food is.
Do you see more delivery-only restaurants coming up post the lockdown?
I have a little bit of a contrarian view on that. See, please understand, in the post-COVID era, what will be the biggest worry in the minds of the consumers? It is about where is my food coming from? And cloud kitchen and ghost kitchens are not the places which really give you a very good imagery on that front. So I think from a commercial angle, yes, because delivery is part of what I call affordable dining segment, value dining segment, it will do well. But in terms of consumer confidence, I think it will face its own challenges. So, yes, we will be waking up to new challenges. We will be waking up to a new world. And I think we will know at that point of time how is this whole thing shaping up. We are all waiting right now. And I think we are right now, whatever we are talking is nothing more than educated guesswork. As things crystallize, we'll probably have more deeper discussions on this.
And last, we talk about Chandrapur. Yesterday, the number of coronavirus cases in India rose to 12,759. Currently, Maharashtra is the worst affected state in the country with over 3,000 cases now and 295 deaths. There are only a handful of districts in the state that don't have a positive case right now. And one of them is Chandrapur. In this segment, Iram Siddiqui, a reporter from Maharashtra, joins us to talk about the unique way in which this district is trying to prevent the virus from entering its borders. Iram, could you talk about the measures that the Chandrapur district is taking right now to ensure that the virus doesn't spread in the region?
So Chandrapur is sharing border with 8 districts, despite being a 0 district itself. To the north of Chandrapur is Nagpur, which already has more than 50 cases, and Yavatmal has another 10 cases. Then it also has Telangana, 2 districts from Telangana, which have 11 and 3 cases respectively. So there was a need felt to restrict the movement of people within the area so that, adequate social distancing is maintained. Now, one of the way thought was to ensure that only one person from one family steps out of their house, even if it is to buy any kind of supplies. Now, a way to do that was by introducing a special pass. Now, each day of the week was given a special color on which only one member of one family could step out to buy supplies. Monday had a different color. For example, the color for Monday was white. For Tuesday, it was pink. For Wednesday, it was green, and so on and so forth. So what essentially it did was Chandrapur had 85,000 families. They were divided into 5 different groups with one color each. And from those 85,000 families, only 15,000 people were allowed to step out. So that is how the whole population was staggered throughout the week to ensure that even in marketplaces and other areas, there's adequate social distancing because the population stepping out is way lesser.
How did they come up with this idea?
So what was found was as the curfew was extended, the lockdown, the number of people who were stepping out of their house was increasing. People would just walk from one ward or one corner of the town to the other corner of the town just to buy vegetables. When stopped, they would say it's cheaper on the other side. So people had this curiosity to step out more. What was found was in the vegetable markets, there would be huge number of people there. So the time the curfew imposed in Chandrapur is from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. Anybody who wants to buy any kind of essential service is not allowed to go out after 2 p.m. All your groceries, shopping and everything. But in that time, marketplaces were heavily crowded because everybody would step out. That is one of the bigger challenges, that in small pockets there are a huge number of people coming out. So everybody would go to a specific market to buy these supplies, and that would be a time that was found as a real challenge for the administration to cut down the numbers. So they wanted to sort of stagger it in a way that even if people are coming out, they're in fewer numbers. Lesser people step out at a given point of time. So they thought the best way would be to issue some passes that will allow only one person to step out with one pass, because there's no real other way to sort of stop people from getting out, because everybody would have some reason or the other. Many members from one particular family who would go out. So that was the whole idea. So these passes also have the ward number. So, for example, if I may belong to a ward, so I will only be restricted to walk around in that ward to buy supplies. And if I'm found loitering in another ward, despite having a pass, I will be pulled up.
And you mentioned in your piece that there's also a fine that you'll have to pay if you don't follow these rules and if you don't follow social distancing.
Yeah. So as a deterrent, they have introduced a fine of rupees 500. So they don't want to be very stringent. So they use a mobile app. So if you're found once or twice, they'll click your picture and store it with your coordinates. But if you are found doing it more than twice, then you are penalized and rupees 500 as a penalty is imposed. So Ballarpur has already done this, which is the second most populated city of Chandrapur. And they have so far collected 45,000 rupees in fine from different people who have not abided by these norms.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.